All right. Hello, everyone. So, welcome to our virtual event space. My name is Allie. You might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location. I'm your host for the evening. I am so excited to be introducing Clyde Ford here to discuss his new book, Of Blood and Sweat. But before we get into the good stuff, on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. For those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. We are having more and more events in person, which is so exciting, but our online event program is sticking around to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. If you haven't gotten your hands on any of the books that come up this evening and you'd like to, I will be linking books in chat. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in and grab a copy off the shelf, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local or not leaving the house, we of course ship. So go ahead and follow those links in chat to our website. While you're over on our website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up this spring. So if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course, follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. So tonight we're here for about an hour, and towards the end we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It's different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in chat. We love to hear from you. But when it comes time for questions, please do make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. While you're in our chat and question spaces, I want to remind you to please lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, should any technical issues arise, which can happen in the world of Zoom, we will work as quickly as we can to resolve them, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. All right, so now it's time for us all to settle in, because without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce Clyde Ford, the author of 13 award-winning books of fiction and nonfiction, including Think Black, which won the 2021 Washington Center for the Book Award in Creative Nonfiction. He has received the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Foundation Legacy Award in Fiction. The Bellingham Washington Mayor's Arts Award in Literature, was named a literary lion by the King County Library System numerous times and has been voted the best writer in Bellingham, Washington. He's also a psychotherapist, an accomplished mythologist, and currently a speaker for Humanities Washington. The book tonight is Of Blood and Sweat: Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth, which tells the story of how Black labor helped to create and sustain the wealth of the white 1% throughout American history. So thank you all so much for being here. Audience members, please do not be shy in chat or if you need anything. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our speaker. So welcome, Clyde. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. And I so appreciated that kind introduction. As I was listening to that, I was wondering to myself, exactly who is that she's introducing? Sounds like a pretty interesting person. Maybe I'd like to get to know him. This opportunity to be here with you, even though it's not in person, and I certainly wish it was, actually continues the tradition of me speaking at Third Place Books, in particular Lake Forest Park, that goes back almost to the beginning of the opening of the public market there and Third Place Books place there. So I've had the fortune to speak at Third Place Books for a number of years. I've very much appreciated the support of third place books, and I'm really glad to be back here again. What I'd like to do this evening is a couple of things. I'd like to read a very short selection from my book to give you a sense of how the book sounds. And then I'd like to talk about some of the issues that I think the book raises, particularly some of the issues that are in our current public discourse around critical race theory and reparations for slavery. And I hope in all that process that I'll be able to at least go through some of the epochs covered, the time periods covered in the book, so you've got a little bit of a better sense of what this book is all about. So why don't we start by me reading from the first chapter of A Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth. Anthony Negro and Isabel Negro is how they were known in the 1625 ledger of Captain William Tucker of Elizabeth City, Virginia. In all likelihood, they also had African names only the ages know now. They may have been baptized shortly after birth, and their anglicized names conferred then by Portuguese priests who ventured deep into the interior of Angola, where Catholicism was well established by the 16th century. Or Portuguese priests may have performed obligatory baptisms and christenings of these two young people as they were herded into the hold of the St. John the Baptist, a Portuguese slave ship at anchor in Luanda Bay off the coast of Angola in the late Central African rainy season of 1619. Let's call them Anthony and Isabella for our narrative. Two among the 20 and odd Negroes Sir John Rolfe recorded aboard the Dutch man-of-war White Lion, laying at anchor on August 20th, 1619, at the mouth of the James River off Point Comfort, Virginia. Anthony and Isabella carried within them the germinal seeds of the first Black child to be born in America, though on that fateful day in August 1619, they probably did not know that. Nor did they know his name. Nor could they have known that symbolically they also carried within them the germinal cells of Scipio and Crispus and Nat and Sojourner and Maggie and Frederick and Booker T and W.E.B. and Marcus and Langston and Duke and Yardbird and Train and Malcolm and Martin and Rosa and Barack and Trayvon and Eric and Brianna and George and me. And countless millions who in some measure or part were torn like them from Africa's soil. Anthony and Isabella stepped from the decks of the White Lion into a pinnace bobbing in the surf off Point Comfort, a small boat that would carry them to the white planters and merchants and colonists waiting ashore, men who had just determined their worth in terms of salted meat and vegetables and grain and the other provisions needed by the captain of the White Lion. What they did not know then, could not know then, is that in being handed over to these men, they were about to embark on a journey of unimaginably epic proportions. A heroic journey in which during their lives, they would endure great hardships and privations, a symbolic journey that would see their work lay the foundation for the economics, politics, religion, medicine, education, industry, law enforcement, and technology of a new nation, and a hard-earned journey that would generate great power and wealth for some that sadly, Anthony and Isabella and those like them would, for the most part, never share. In their interactions with those white men ashore lay the embryonic maps of many roads, some surveyed and taken, others surveyed and deemed unworthy. American slavery, American freedom, Bacon's Rebellion, the Revolutionary War, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Cotton Gin, the Age of Soil, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, railroads, mines, oil drillings, lynchings, Red Summer, 2 world wars, 2 marches on Washington, the murders of Malcolm and Martin, the gunning down of Trayvon and Ahmaud, the killing of George Floyd, and the many, many other events shaped by the interaction of Black folks and white folks here in America. Anthony and Isabella did not know this then, and neither did the white men on shore, like Captain William Tucker, who would acquire and settle the couple to work on his plantation near present-day Hampton, Virginia. But today, we can know what became of those seeds, real and symbolic, which Anthony and Isabella carried within them. We can know of the roads taken and those that were not. And where Anthony and Isabella could not know, we must not forget. Thank you. That's really the opening words of the first chapter of the book. And what's probably most important for me is that I try to craft a book that would present history in a way that was accessible to everyone, so that it was not just a dry reporting of facts and figures and statistics that in many ways can make history somewhat abstract and not relevant, but that it was personal, that it was a story told as best as possible through the eyes and the experience and the life of those who were actually there, like Anthony and Isabella, who we actually know were among those 20 and odd Africans on board the White Lion, who came ashore on August 20th, 1619. And we know that because, as I said in that reading, there was a 1625 muster that is essentially a census of the residents of this area. And they were on the census for the plantation, actually often considered the first plantation in America, owned by one Captain William Tucker. And in 1625, Anthony and Isabella had a child. His name was William. And the wonderful thing about that, and I think really symbolic of many things that were important to me in writing this book, is that the family of William Tucker is still alive, has a society called the William Tucker Society. And now the many relatives who are connected to that family meet on a regular basis, and it has become a part and a fabric of life in the Virginia roads, the Hampton, Virginia area. And it was great just to be able to discover that deep connection to the very beginnings of the book and of Africans here in colonial America. I think it was about 10 days ago that the LA Times published an op-ed that I had written, in which I talked about what it was like to be a Black author these days, and how I never believed in my wildest imagination that being a Black author might put my life and put me at risk. And yet, not just me, but authors like Ibram Kendi, who wrote that book on anti-racism, really important book that many people are using, now has to go from event to event with a security detail. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, the journalist who did that wonderful project for the New York Times, 1619, and was then lambasted by the Trump White House, received death threats on her social media. And it was so bizarre, but also interesting in that I don't think it was more than an hour and a half after the LA Times released that op-ed on their website. Wasn't even in print. They didn't even put it in print yet. That didn't come until the following day that I started to get these threats on my social media accounts and in my inbox for my email as well too. And one of the reasons I believe that those of us who are Black authors and trying to tell the story of what it was like for the African presence here in America, I think we are then often in the crosshairs because of this really false and very inappropriate understanding that people actually on both sides of the issues have about critical race theory. So I just want to spend a minute saying something about that, because it is almost always the first question that I get in my interviews, whether it was on Good Morning America or in some of the other interviews I've had, and people ask, is this a book about critical race theory? And I think it's simply because it's published at a time when critical race theory is in the news. What most people don't realize is that you write a book and you don't see that book for about 2 years. So I actually finished this book in 2020, and critical race theory was not as prevalent in the news then as it is now. And the book didn't come out until just last week. So I think in some ways it's very fortuitous about when the book hit based on when this discussion is happening in this country. But I just want to say a few words about critical race theory so that you'll understand what I mean when I say this is not a book about critical race theory, because I know that those who are pushing this narrative that there's something wrong about critical race theory, that critical race theory is being taught in school, that are passing laws through, there are at least 30 some odd states now that have laws at various stages of enactment against the teaching of critical race theory in school. I listen to the governors of these states talk, and I have to say, I laugh at the inability of people who are supposed to have some sense of smarts about them, the inability that they have of distinguishing the difference between a theory and a set of facts. Look, a theory, critical race theory, for example, is a lens or a way of attempting to understand an assemblage of facts. You look back at history and you try to understand the facts that you're faced with, and often you will say, well, I have this theory, and maybe this theory will help me understand those facts. But the important thing, the really, really important thing is for us to understand facts are not theory, and theory is not facts. Theory is a way you try to understand facts. Facts are an assemblage of events, if we're talking historically, that we can in some way document that actually took place. And that's why I say this is not a book about critical race theory. This is a book about historical truths, historical facts. What I find very interesting is that in writing the book, and you might find in reading the book, that the historical facts that I have assembled, I think in many ways support the theory of critical race theory. But then again, they support a lot of the other theories that I talk about in the book as well too. And that's a really important distinction that I'm afraid is lost on our friends who would in some way insist that critical race theory not be taught in school. I think what they're really insisting on is, I don't want to know the truth about what happened in American history. I would rather simply know and have my children know the fabrication of the actual story of this country. And I'll say a little bit more about why I think that's so sad and tragic and dangerous towards the end of my talk. But let me then, having said that, just take you through, step you through some of the epics that I talk about in this book. Maybe mention 2 or 3 of the historical truths that come during these time periods, why I think those are important, and why I included them in the book. And I think that ought to give you a really good sense of the overview for this book and what it's all about. So I know it's popular to begin talking about the history of race in this country, to talking about the African presence in this country by going back to the date of 1619. And many people will say slavery started in the United States in 1619. I don't believe that, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But I also know that as a historian, I felt that you can't tell the story by starting when the story starts. Because there's always, to any story, there is what? A backstory. And the backstory helps you understand how you get to the main story. So if the main story is the arrival of Africans in 1619 in Virginia off the coast of Jamestown near Point Comfort, what's the backstory? And the backstory was fascinating. The backstory starts, and the book starts then with Anthony and Isabella, actually starts in pre-colonial times in the Angola-Congo region of Africa. And while I could spend obviously most of this evening just on the backstory, let me just say that a couple of things that I found so interesting about the backstory is one, the relationship between Europe and Africa, even by the 1500s, was pretty deep and pretty long. Catholicism was well established in the Angola-Congo region by that time. And the African groups that were in this Angola-Congo region, they weren't dummies. They understood that Catholicism might be this interesting force to use in their contest with each other. So there was a kingdom of the Ndongo, and there was a kingdom of the Congo, which was the larger one, and they fought back and forth, and they tried to enlist the help of Catholicism, and the Portuguese, who were the first European colonizers there, realized, oh, this is great. We got two African tribes fighting each other, and so the Portuguese lined up sometimes with the kingdom of the Congo, other times with the Ndongo, and eventually they ended up siding with the Kingdom of the Congo against the Ndongo. And in the warring between the Kingdom of the Congo and Ndongo, what happened is that the Portuguese were able to essentially extract human beings, which they then sold either to Spanish colonies in the New World or they used in their own colonies in the New World. So I found that really fascinating to understand a little bit more about where the first Africans in colonial America came from. It is, however, there's a little bit of a story about how do you get from Angola to the Portuguese and Spanish colonies in the New World, which are in Central and South America, to Virginia. And that also was just a fascinating chapter to understand. I didn't fully understand it, didn't even understand. And this, again, just as an aside, I found it was so fascinating to realize that there's even a Hollywood connection to that story of how Africans got from Angola, Congo to Virginia. And the African connection is actually through, believe it or not, Johnny Depp and Pirates of the Caribbean. So let me just tell you a little bit of that story. I tell a lot more of it in the book. It's an interesting chapter in the history and the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And basically, here's that next part of the book. Britain did not like the fact that they were not in control of the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, it was Spain and Portugal who were. And so Britain said, you know what? And this is the Queen at the time, Queen Elizabeth, who basically said, I'm going to send out mariners who I am going to basically give legal authority to be pirates. And their job will be to raid the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Central and South America, to attack any ships that they find on the seas, to loot them, to take whatever goods that they find aboard. If they find human beings, to take them as well too, and to sell them and bring me back as much money as they can. So all of the people you've heard of, like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake, and John Hawkins and his father, all of these, how should we say, the pirates, really they were legalized pirates. They were often called privateers. There was one privateer, and again, don't want to go too much into this, but just to say, there was one privateer who was an Englishman who bought a ship and outfitted it and had it become a legal pirate ship under the Dutch. And it was that ship which raided a Portuguese ship carrying Africans they had captured in the wars in Angola, Congo, raided that ship in the Spanish Main. Now, the Spanish Main is the body of water we know as the Gulf of Mexico. And it was that ship, the White Lion, which took Africans off of the St. John the Baptist Portuguese ship and thought, you know what? This is the captain of that ship. I'm not going to sell these Africans to South America and Central America because England has just established a new colony in Virginia. So I think that I'm going to try to get these enslaved, well, they weren't enslaved at this point, to get these captured Africans up to Virginia and sell them there. That is how Africans first came to America, because they were raided by a ship. And the connection, just let me make that connection between Pirates of the Caribbean and that event. That ship, the White Lion, many scholars think was the model for what is called the Flying Dutchman. Remember the Flying Dutchman in Pirates of the Caribbean, the ship that's never able to find port. And the Flying Dutchman, remember it was a Dutch flag ship. The Flying Dutchman was considered to be the captain of that ship. Again, I tell more of that story in the book. It's a fascinating connection, and it's an important connection. And it's important for this reason. Again, I said a lot of people think that slavery started 1619 when Africans stepped off the boat in Virginia. I would say it did not. And it did not for this particular reason. There was no legal system, no religious system of slavery that the white men and the planter class and the wealthy folks on shore had, in which they simply said, God, you know, let's wait around until we get some folks from Africa and then we can just dump them into this system we already have. And I think it does us, and by us I mean Americans, a great disservice to simply say that slavery started in 1619, because it didn't. It took about 50 years before the ideas, the systems, the institutions of chattel slavery actually fully developed. And in that 50 years, there are roads that were taken and roads that were not. And for me, what I got in this part of the book was this real sense that democracy is a series of choices. And if you look back in the history of our country, supposedly a democracy, what you can see at almost every turn is that choices were made against the idea of this country opening up to become the full and complete democracy that it might have been. So that by 1660 and 1670, the laws, the religious support, the economic support, the law enforcement support for a system of chattel slavery really was in place. And understanding how that transition happened, which is really what I tried to do in the second, third, fourth chapters of the book, I think is critical for us understanding our history as a country and why there were roads taken and roads that were not. Okay, so now again, I'm kind of going historically in this brief summary of the book. The next portion of the book, we're starting to inch closer to the American Revolution. And what I found so surprising in this chapter of the book was an understanding, and I really did not fully get this before, that the founders, most of the men, the founding fathers of this country, were not only slave owners, most of the Southern ones were, but more importantly even, and I do think more importantly, they not only owned slaves, but they were in great debt. And so I do have a chapter in the book called Founding Debtors, Founding Documents, because the importance of that should not be lost on us in understanding our history. Take somebody like Thomas Jefferson, for example. When he died in 1826, on July 4th, he was in debt to the tune of today of $2 million. That's pretty significant because there really was never a point in his life, at least in his later years, that he was not in debt. And what did he do to try to forestall that debt? He pledged the enslaved men and women that he had as collateral to the European investors that continued to lend him money over the years. Now, there is a historical fact. I didn't make that up. I went to the Library of Congress, and even on the book's website, www.ofbloodandsweat.com, I have an actual image, a copy of, in Jefferson's handwriting, him writing to his creditors in England and also in the Netherlands saying, look, I know I owe you all this money, but what I'll do, I will repay you, but as collateral for that repayment, I'm going to pledge, and he wrote by name the enslaved African men and women that he had. Now, why do I say that that fact is maybe even more damning and more important than just the fact that Jefferson and Washington and Madison and certainly the Southern founders owned slaves? For this reason, we tend to believe in this country that somehow these founders were these great intellectual thinkers who came up with the ideas of liberty and fraternity and equality enshrined in the founding documents of America. Edmund S. Morgan, the late Edmund S. Morgan, a professor at Yale University, was to remind us of a very interesting fact about the founders. Morgan was to say, wait a minute, without holding people enslaved, the founders could not and would not have come up with all these lofty ideals that we take to be self-evident truths. Without bondage, Morgan said, there would have been no freedom. Freedom is not possible, or was not possible during those days, except built on top of bondage. Now that's a theory, by the way. That's a theory, and it's an interesting theory not only to put forth, but to try to see if it holds any water. Here's what Morgan was getting at, and I think it's a very savvy, profound theory that holds truth not only back in the early 1700s, certainly throughout the 1700s, but also today. And I'll mention how I think it's relevant today in a moment. But let's just go back to the early 1700s, actually the end of the 1600s, because what you had in colonial Virginia, colonial America at that time, mostly Virginia and America in the South, was the development of the first cash crop, tobacco. And in the book, I describe exactly what it takes to grow, farm, package, and sell tobacco. It is a grueling, time-consuming process. Plant seeds, take them out, transplant the little plants to other areas, watch them grow, make sure there's no bugs on them as they're growing. Once they get to a certain height, cut the flowers off on top so they don't flower, and therefore you get more sweetness in the leaves because more nutrients are filled out in the leaves. Watch the leaves grow to a certain point, but don't let them grow too much. Make sure you know when to cut them. Leave them on the ground to dry for a period of time. Then move them inside a barn and let them cure, but don't let them get too moist because they'll get too moldy. It is a time-consuming process that if Jefferson and Washington and Madison and the Southern farmers had to actually do themselves, they would not have had time to pontificate on the lofty ideals that we hold as self-evident truths in the great founding documents of this country. That's what Morgan was trying to get at. Jefferson and Washington and Madison and the other founders, Southern founders for sure, held enslaved people who did that work for them, so they didn't have to do that work. So they had the leisure to pontificate on these founding principles. Freedom the freedom to pontificate and to feel as though somehow you were free to do this really rested on a foundation of holding others enslaved or in bondage. And that I thought was a really important idea that I see carried through many epochs in American history, and certainly true even today. Look, the pandemic laid this perfectly clear. During the pandemic, in the early phases, there were some individuals who were considered what? Essential workers, we called them. Of course, at first they were revered. People even celebrated them, applauded them, and eventually they just moved into the background. People paid them no mind. In fact, in some instances, when it was essential workers who were there to try to make sure that people wore masks and did other things, they were treated really poorly and really shabbily, and yet we saw right then that there is an underclass of individuals in this country who support the privileges that so many other people have. And that is another instance of freedoms or privileges based on bondage, because these people were literally bound to the jobs they had. They couldn't leave because of the economic situation they had and things of that nature. So the founders were debtors. They were debtors in part because they actually had extended themselves so far with their tobacco crops and their lavish lifestyles that they were in tune, they were in hock to European creditors for lots and lots of money. And one of the things, and there's no way that I would say it's the only reason, but one of the reasons that they were very receptive to the idea of a revolutionary war is, guess what? If you win the war, you also get rid of a lot of the debt that you owed. What I found so cynical in writing these chapters is that these founders, even as they held other men and women enslaved, talked about feeling that they were enslaved to European creditors. I just found that unbelievable to feel that that was true. So, I'm skipping ahead a little bit more. So let's skip now past the Revolutionary War and let's get to 1787, Philadelphia, and the Second Constitutional Convention that was held in Philadelphia. One of the things I say in the book, and one of the things I think was really, really important, is an understanding that 25% of the United States Constitution is based on the North appeasing the South over one issue and one issue alone, and that's slavery. The word slave is not mentioned in the Constitution. It's mentioned once, I believe, in the Bill of Rights. And yet, if you read the actual conversations and arguments and debates that took place between Northern delegates and Southern delegates time and time again, whether it's the Second Amendment on gun rights, or whether it's the Intercommerce Clause, or even the Fugitive Slave Clause, which was originally in the Constitution, when you read the discussions that happened over that, you are left with the unmistakable conclusion of, oh my God, the South held the North hostage. And some of the Southern delegates even said, you want a United States, you want a Constitution? You had better make sure that we get our Southern way of life, which is code word for you better make sure that we can still hold men and women enslaved. Just to give you some examples of that. The Interstate Commerce Clause, right? You think, oh my God, we think trucks, big trucks driving between states. And what does that have to do with slavery? But the original Interstate Commerce Clause was put in place, and basically the Interstate Commerce Clause says, you are governed by the laws of the state that you come from. So basically, if you've got Tennessee plates on your truck, for example, then you're governed by the laws of Tennessee. And it says a lot more than that, but that's essentially what the Interstate Commerce Clause is. Why was it put in place? It's put in place for this reason. Slave owners from the South were worried if they went across the border to another state in which slavery had been outlawed, then if they carried their enslaved men and women with them, that person would immediately, upon crossing the border, be free. They didn't want that. And they basically said, look, our property, we want something that enshrines that right in the Constitution. And it is. It's right there in the Constitution. And the other thing that we are dealing with the direct influence and problems today is the whole business of the 3/5 clause, right? So the North was concerned that the South would have too many people if they counted the enslaved men and women that they had with them. Now, I find this, again, an incredibly cynical proposition because, of course, the South is obviously not going to give voting rights to the people they enslaved, but they wanted to count them for the purposes of representation in the Congress. So the North is concerned about that. Instead of saying the only way you get to do this is if you extend the right to vote to them, the North came up with this formula, which was, okay, what we're going to do is we will count the enslaved men and women you hold as 3/5 of a person, actually enslaved men. And that will be the basis upon which we determine representation in the Congress, and also the basis upon which we elect a president. Now, while the 3/5 clause has been repealed from the Constitution, that use of that clause as the basis for determining representation, and even more importantly, for determining the electoral college by which we elect the president, is still in place. And so I say in the book, and I think, and I hope everybody understands, America is not a popular democracy. America is not a popular democracy. We do not vote for president and elect a president based on the will of the people. We elect a president based on the will of the electors, and those electors are in place based on a formula that comes directly from the days in which the North appeased the South over slave trade and slavery. And I think the other thing, just to briefly mention, is the same is true with the Second Amendment. I don't care how much the NRA and gun supporters say that their right to carry arms is enshrined in the Constitution. What is enshrined in the Constitution is the word militia. And if you understand, if you are a strict constructionalist, and that means if you interpret the Constitution as it was written, and in that regard, I am a strict constructionalist. If you go back to the original arguments, militia meant slave patrol. It was a code word. It was a dog whistle for slave patrol. And so even the Second Amendment, which enshrines the rights of citizens to raise a militia, that really means it enshrines the rights of individuals and states to raise slave patrols for the point in view of controlling the enslaved men and women that they held in those days. So again, I try to talk about some of the background to the Constitution. Following that, I also talk about, where this whole business about policing and law enforcement comes from. I can't help but remember, as I was writing this chapter on policing, I began to think that image of Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck. I kept thinking, I've seen this before. Where have I seen it? I've seen this before. Where have I seen it? No, it wasn't with Eric Garner in Staten Island, although he also said that he couldn't breathe. And I kept thinking, where have I seen it? Where have I seen it? Then I remembered where I'd seen it. I'd seen it in some illustrated text related to the Old Testament and the Bible. And there is a picture there of, I believe it's an Assyrian king who has his foot on the neck of another king that he has just vanquished. And those of you who have read the Bible know that the Old Testament is a very, very violent text and treatise on what you can and what you should and what you will do to your enemies. And part of what this king is saying is it's just fine to put your foot on the neck of your enemies. And I kept thinking, that image is deeply ingrained in people, particularly those in the West. And it is so old, it's way older than just slave patrols, which I know that some folks believe that's where the history of policing goes back. So actually going back that early, I began to ask myself the question, okay, if it's older than slave patrols, what else can we learn about the history of policing? And was to discover that modern day policing is actually based on ideas that came over to the United States in the 13th century from England, and they haven't changed much since then. Love to say more about that again, as with just about anything. We could spend all night talking about that. What I will say is this. I started off writing the chapter about policing, really believing that reform was possible and that the idea of defunding the police is probably not a good idea. I ended the chapter thinking, I don't think reform is possible at all. I think we have to rethink policing from the ground up, because any system which is based on ideas that are 750 years old probably doesn't work in the modern world. So again, that was really, in a certain way, one of the things that helped me, this idea that I could write a book that would also help me come to terms with some of these important issues that we're dealing with very much even today. So again, I'm skipping huge chunks and huge sections of history, but what I'm going to do with a hop, skip, and jump, and you can read more of the details in the book, is I want to talk about the period right after the Civil War, the period we call Reconstruction, and I want to do it for this reason. Again, about 10 days ago, it's amazing how many things happen in clusters, but about 10 days ago, the California State Commissions on Reparations for Slavery made a very important decision, and they voted on a principle that they will then use as the basis of going forward with the idea of reparations. And the principle was that reparations should only be granted to those who can genealogically trace back their ancestry to the period of enslavement. I personally think it was a good decision that they came to. Now, that doesn't mean that there are other folks, particularly folks of color, low income, who have been subject to discrimination and racism. But reparations is a very specific remedy for a very specific situation. Now, what is often lost on people in this discussion of reparations is the history of reparations in this country. A lot of people will say, hey, I wasn't even born during slavery. Obviously not born during slavery, but my family wasn't here during slavery. My family came in the early 1900s, or my family never held people enslaved. Why should I have anything to do with repaying reparations? Here is something that even the United States Congress and Abraham Lincoln understood immediately after slavery, is that the 250 years that the United States had held men and women enslaved had disadvantaged them to the point that reparations was necessary. And now I'm not talking modern terms. I'm talking about 1868, when General William T. Sherman, who was Lincoln's Civil War general, came up with an idea that many of us know today as 40 acres and a mule. Actually, that was America's first reparations plan, and was pretty darn good one, I have to say, because while it was a lot more than just 40 acres and a mule, what it really was that the United States Congress, in this case, the Union Congress that had been victorious in the war, decided that they would take away first 400,000 acres of land from the former slave owners in the South, and then an additional 500,000, so almost 1 million acres of land, they would take away from white slave owners and redistribute it to the formerly enslaved. Now, they even call this a reparations for slavery. And wow, I think that's a pretty darn good plan, particularly in 1868, because land is the basis of wealth. A bureau was established by the Congress in 1868. In fact, two bureaus, first iteration of the Freedmen's Bureau, second iterations of the Freedmen's Bureau. And one of the major purposes of the Freedmen's Bureau was to redistribute this land. It was General Oliver Otis Howard, who Howard University, historical Black university, is named after. General Howard himself was not African American, but he certainly served in a very important way, because it was under him, who he was at the time director of the Freedmen's Bureau, that nearly 40,000 African American families had begun the process of this land redistribution and got title to this land. 1865, Lincoln is killed. Andrew Johnson steps in as his successor, the next president of the United States. And one of the first things that Johnson does is to rescind Sherman's order It's called Special Field Orders 15. He then took away the land that had been distributed to African Americans in this way and returned all of that 900,000 acres of land to the original slave owners, who then used it as the basis for sharecropping and tenant farming and essentially slavery by another name. So when I hear this discussion of reparations, and in particular, I'll often hear people even say, I might be in favor of reparations, but where do you start? How do you figure out a dollar figure? I have no clue. I do. I've got a lot of clues about where to start. Actually, it's a simple single clue. That 900 acres of land is well known. The map of that 900,000 acres, I actually reproduce it on the book's website so you can see it, see where it is. It's in coastal southern United States, from northern Florida to about the middle of South Carolina, and then inland for a certain number of miles. It's really rich, very fertile farmland originally. Now you've got, a lot of development on it, and you've got all of, like Hilton Head Island and other places in South Carolina. So my formula for reparations is pretty simple. A good place to start is you take that 900,000 acres of land, which is well known, you value it at today's value, and that can be fairly easily figured out. You don't redistribute it, because I don't think you need to or should displace people at this point. But whatever the value of that land comes up to in today's terms, that's the figure you start reparations talks with. And eventually, I think, California will get to that point. Seattle Times this coming weekend is going to print an op-ed that I've written about how Washington State should also jump into this field of reparations. What a lot of people don't know, and this is a little bit aside, I don't talk about this in the book, but I think it's important for us Washingtonians to know this, is, Washington actually has a track record in reparations. Now, it's not reparations for African slavery or the enslavement of people of African descent, but Japanese internment during World War II, when a Civil Liberties Act was passed in 1988, signed by President Ronald Reagan, who apologized to the nation, or apologized on behalf of the nation for the internment of Japanese Americans. Washington State, 5 years earlier, in 1983, had already written a bill which said, we did the wrong thing by Japanese Americans and they are entitled to reparations. The act is still on the books in the Revised Code of Washington, our RCW, and it's called Reparations for False Termination from Jobs and Work. And it is specifically defines how reparations will be granted, how people can apply for it. And I've often looked at that and said, if we as a state and we as a nation realize the undeserved harm that was done to our brothers and sisters who are Japanese Americans, we ought to also realize and be able to come to terms with the undeserved harm that was done for many, many more years to our African American citizens as well too. So in the book, I talk a little bit more about the history of reparations in this country, because this is a book which tries to look at the history, but I think it's an important source for all of us to understand the current discourse that's going on in this country around reparations. Now, I end the book shortly after the Civil War. And I do that for a particular reason. Or I guess I want to say that I end volume 1 shortly after the Civil War, hoping that there'll be a volume 2 and maybe a volume 3 as well too. And there's a good reason to end volume 1 there. I end volume 1 with the story of that period of time called Reconstruction. And it just provides a wonderful opportunity for us to end, because it ends the story where there's this moment of great hope in America. And the formerly enslaved are running state houses or state legislatures. They're even in governorships. And what happens is Well, I'll let you read more about the story of what happens that turns all of that around. And suddenly now we are a country where Jim Crow is the law of the land, and not all of the tremendous possibilities that were in front of us shortly after the Civil War. Another road not taken. I know I've talked a lot, and you probably get to see me pulling out my professorial self. I taught African American history for a while at Western Washington University. But I think we're coming to the end of the point of just listening to me talk. And I hope that I get to hear you ask some questions and maybe take a shot at trying to answer some of those questions as well. So Ali, are there any questions that are there in the audience for us to contemplate? If not, believe me, I'm sure you realize I can probably continue talking.
So I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A as of yet. We've got just a couple more minutes. So if anybody has questions, now is the time. Type away furiously. We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, I have a quick question.
Yes.
In your research, was there something that surprised you as you were working on this book?
There were a lot of things that surprised me. I think the first thing that surprised me was understanding the roads that this country could have taken even early on that would probably have set us on foot for a really expensive democracy. So early on in the 1600s, between 1620 and 1660, the possibilities were that we could have recognized that there were workers of different colors. There were Native American workers here, there were African workers here, and there were white workers here. And we could have said, particularly the workers could have said, you know what? We want to organize as a group so that our interests are supported and advocated for. Those in the ruling class, planter merchants in those days, were very, very nervous about the workers recognizing the power that existed in coming together. And so what you see in those early days is laws passed to make sure that Black workers, or I should say that white workers hate Black workers, that white workers hate Native American workers, that Native Americans are set against African Americans, and African Americans are set against Native Americans. That is so clear in the early laws of this country that that was the road chosen. That was one thing that was really surprising to me. I think another thing, I already mentioned this, it was surprising to me the extent to which the founders were debtors. I never heard that in history. That's never spoken about in the American history that I learned about, and yet it is so essential. And of course, that debt was based on the lifestyles they had, but also based on the crops they raised, and the crops they raised were based on the people that were enslaved by them. So, and essentially, there's an example where you've got debt that was based on, in fact, even collateralized on, based on the enslaved individuals that you had. So I was really, really surprised about that. Another thing I was surprised about, I'm just ticking off all of these things that I think I can think of as I wrote the book. When Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a lot of people thought, oh my God, cotton gin, it's going to just dramatically reduce the amount of time that it takes to pick and separate out cotton seed from cotton lint, and you want the lint. And that's going to be really great. That's going to reduce the reliance on enslaved labor, and slavery is going to go away. Just the opposite happened. Farmers realized they could make so much money if they could just keep those hungry cotton machines fed, that right after Whitney invented, or I don't even want to use the word invented, he didn't invent it, but right after he fought for the patent rights to the cotton gin, enslavement in this country exploded. Went from about 800,000 individuals in 1790, 10 years later, beginning of the 1800s, almost 4 million individuals. And one of the reasons that happened was simply because of the need to feed the cotton gins. So I was really surprised about how technology, and that was the height of technology, was very much in support of the enslavement of individuals, or supported it. And the last thing I'll say, although there are many other moments in the book that surprised me, I was surprised by reading. I had never read closely the Emancipation Proclamation. I was surprised that upon reading that document closely, there is no other conclusion you can come to other than that Lincoln never freed one slave that was under his control. The Emancipation Proclamation is a document about freeing slaves in the Confederacy. Well, the Confederacy never recognized Lincoln's authority to begin with. So under the Emancipation Proclamation, an enslaved individual in Mississippi was free, but an enslaved individual in Massachusetts or Delaware could still be held enslaved. And it was so bizarre to realize the extent to which the emancipation was nothing more than a document of war, as opposed to this great document about the enslavement of people of African descent. That was really surprising to me as well, too. So thanks for that question. I think I see there might be another question in the Q&A, and I'm more than happy to take a stab at it.
So this, I think, is more of a comment than a question, but Linda says, I'm in the middle of reading 1619. It sounds like your book will give me a deeper understanding of what I'm learning.
Well, that's a wonderful book. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones did a great job with 1619. I would say if there's a difference between Of Blood and Sweat and 1619, it is that I tried to tell the story from an individual point of view. So each chapter really tries to pick a personal viewpoint to tell the story, whether it's the story of Anthony and Isabella, who I extend out through 3 or 4 chapters, whether it's the story of a woman who was enslaved to pick cotton, and we have her story because it was recorded by the Works Progress Administration in the early 1930s. What I try to do is to tell the story from the point of view of someone who lived that story. I'll just give you a really great example. So one of the first books ever written by a person of African descent here in this country was written by a fellow named Britton Hammond. Britton Hammond was enslaved by a General Winslow in Massachusetts, but Britton Hammond always had this idea he wanted to go to sea as a sailor. He did that, and he wrote a book about this incredible experience of being captured and thrown in jail and fighting for England and France and all this stuff. And so I rewrote that because he didn't really tell it from a personal point of view. I wanted to tell that story from a very personal point of view. So I put you in his place as he's going through all these experiences, not only to tell the story about him, but also to tell the story about the 18% of the population who were involved in the maritime trade in the Age of Sail were men, usually of African descent. And that's a fascinating story. It is not told most of the time when we talk about the history of this country, and yet it is really important because many of those men were to become the gentlemen who went from the pulpit of a ship to the pulpit of a church, who grew churches, who grew community, who actually knit together an African-American community in this country because they traveled to so many places with news. They had news of what was going on in Europe and other parts of the world. They had news of what was going on in this country, and you can trace the heritage of people like these sailors who then eventually become the porters on the railroad cars, who travel from city to city with news and help to stitch together an African-American community as well too. So, I try to tell this story from a very personal point of view because I think if you put yourself in the shoes, in the life experience of these men and women, it touches you in a different way. And you walk away from it not just knowing facts, but you feel, and I think you do, come away having a sense of what it must have been like for that person. So if anything, that might be the difference between this and 1619. But again, Nicole Hannah-Jones did a spectacular job with that project. And I'm so glad that my book at least can be on your bookshelf beside hers.
Well, it's a wonderful book. We are about at the end of our time this evening. My last question is the one that I always ask.
Yes.
What is on the horizon for you? Is there a project that you can say just a couple words about, or is it a secret?
Well, it's not a secret, and I think you kind of heard me say that before, is that I hope this is just volume 1. I certainly have spec'd out on paper volume 2 and volume 3, and I'll just say this as a teaser for volume 2. Volume 2 starts. Volume 1 ends in Elmira, New York, with a talk by Frederick Douglass, talk that has never really been covered very well. And volume 2 starts in Gujarat, India, with Thurman meeting a famous preacher here by the name of Thurman meeting Mahatma Gandhi. And so I'm not going to say anything more about that other than that. And hopefully I'll have a chance to work on that volume 2. And that's the next project for me.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for this. This has been such an amazing conversation, such an amazing talk. Everyone in the audience, if you would like to get your hands on copies of Blood and Sweat, I'm going to link it in chat one more time. So go ahead and follow that link to go check out the book. Let us know, of course, what you thought of this event in person or on any of our social media. Clyde, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Do you have any last words you'd like to share with us before we say goodnight?
Yes, if you're in the Seattle area, stop by Third Place Books, particularly Lake Forest Park. I know they have autographed copies of the book because I was down there today to sign them.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.